Alright guys, so today we'll start the chapter on the skeletal system. These are just your objectives. These are things that you should study to help kind of guide you as you go through the chapter. The skeletal system includes the bones of the skeleton, obviously, and then other connective tissues that help to hold the skeleton together and help provide cushioning between the bones, etc. Some of those other tissues that are involved include cartilage. Cartilage forms padding between the bones. So like in your leg, for example, you have your femur comes down like this, and then right underneath it, it meets up with your tibia, and that's your knee joint. Well, in that knee joint, you have these little pads of cartilage here and here that provide cushioning between the two bones. So cartilage provides cushioning as well as a smooth surface between the bones, and then ligaments hold bones together. So ligaments connect the bones. So for example, also in your knee, you have a ligament that stretches out here, a ligament out here, and then you have two in the middle that hold the bones together. So the skeletal system includes the skeleton, the bones, as well as the connective tissues associated with the bones. There are numerous different functions of the skeletal system. The most obvious of these is support and structure, right? Strength for the body. Our overall shape and stature is based on our skeleton. If you have long bones, you're tall. If you have short bones, you're short. Again, our overall shape is based off of our skeleton, off of our bone structure. And a lot of other organs and tissues are connected to the bones. So your muscles, for example, are connected to your bones. So the overall position and structure of the body is really dependent on the skeleton or the skeletal system. We also store some important minerals in the bones. The most important of these is calcium. We do also store phosphorus in the bones, but calcium's the most important one. The bones act as kind of a storage site or like a bank account for calcium. Okay, so think of money. If you had, $1,000 cash on you, you probably wouldn't walk around with that $1,000 cash. Instead, you would go put it in the bank. And then if you needed it later, you would get it out of the bank. Well, with calcium, we have to have just the right amount of calcium in our bloodstream. If we have too much, we put it in the bank, which is the bones. So we pack the calcium into the bones. And then later, if we don't have enough calcium, we get it out of the bank. So we'll take it out of our bones. I think we typically think of calcium as just being important for the bones, right? You need calcium for strong bones. And that's true. Calcium does make the bones strong, but that's not the only thing we use calcium for. Calcium is very important in muscle contraction. It's very important in the way that your nerves communicate with each other. It has a lot of other functions besides just the bones. So we need to make sure we have enough of it in the body outside of the bones as well. So we can put extra into the bones and we can take it out of the bones for those other uses. Blood cell production occurs in the skeletal system. Inside our bones, we have something called red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is where we make the blood cells, so the cells that travel around in our bloodstream. The blood cells include red blood cells. Those are the things that carry oxygen and carbon dioxide through your bloodstream. White blood cells, these are the things that help to defend your body against infection. And then platelets. Platelets are important in blood clotting, so to help make the blood thick and sticky when you have an injury so you stop bleeding. Now, all of these cells, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, they travel through the body, through the bloodstream, but they're actually made in the middle of our bones, or inside our bones, inside the skeletal system. And again, the material, the stuff that they're made in is called red bone marrow. There is also a such thing called yellow bone marrow, and we store lipids like triglycerides in the yellow bone marrow, but we're going to really focus on red bone marrow. The skeletal system obviously provides protection for the body. If you think about some of our most delicate organs, they're always surrounded by bones, and those bones provide protection. So think of like your skull. We have this big rounded bone structure, and it surrounds the brain because the brain is very delicate. We can't have things pushing and poking and hitting at the brain. That would damage it very easily. So it's important that we have this skeletal system, right? This bony structure surrounding and protecting the brain. Also, like your breastbone right here, your sternum sits right on top of the heart. Your rib cage, your thoracic cage surrounds your lungs, which are really delicate. So the bones provide a lot of protection for the organs that are underneath them. Finally, the skeletal system is an important component of movement, right? The way that we're able to move our body around purposely. Now, I think that when we say movement, we typically think of the muscles, right? The muscles contract, and that's how we move our body. But think about it. If you just had a muscle right here, and it wasn't attached to anything, right? There was no bone, just a muscle, and the muscle contracts. All that happens is the muscle gets shorter. That's it. You'd have a little bulge right here when the muscle shortened, but nothing would actually happen. There would be no movement. The only reason your body moves when that muscle contracts is because the muscle is attached to a bone. So now when this muscle shortens, it pulls on the bone that it's attached to, and that's how we actually move the body. So the bones act as levers, and they give, leverage. They're levers, and the muscles pull on them, and that's how movement occurs. So movement actually involves the muscles and the bones. Bone tissue is a very specialized type of connective tissue. And when we look at connective tissue, it's really different than the like epithelial tissue. When we just looked at the skin, right, the integumentary system, remember up in the epidermis, we saw cells really closely packed together, right? Like there would be a cell and then a cell and a cell, and the cells are all right next to each other, and they're stacked on top of each other really, really closely, so that the whole tissue in the epidermis was cells, pretty much. There's not much outside of the cells because the cells are really packed together. Connective tissue is not like that. In connective tissue, the cells are scattered. They're separate from each other. They're normally pretty far away from each other. That means that there's a lot of what we call extracellular matrix. Extracellular means outside of the cells. So there's all of this area, all this stuff outside of the cells. That is also another important part of connective tissues. So since bone is a connective tissue, it has both of those components. It has cells, and then it has this extracellular matrix. So bones consist of living cells and a non-living matrix. Again, I'm going to add extracellular, which is outside of the cells. So the cells represent very, very little of the bone. So most of your bones are not cells. Cells are only about 2% of bone's mass. So that means 98% of your bone's mass is all this stuff, this just dead stuff outside of the cells. There's not very much of the bone is cells. But the cells are really important because they're the things that actually make the matrix. The types of cells that we see present in the bone include osteocytes. These are the main cells. And then osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteoprogenitor cells. In general, again, the purpose of these bones is to maintain the bone matrix. So they're the ones that keep up with the bone matrix and keep the bone matrix strong. Right? So they help to repair the bones to keep them strong and healthy. And then the cells are also important in bone growth. So about 2% of bone's mass is made up of cells. That means that the other 98% of bone mass is this dense extracellular matrix. Now, the extracellular matrix, the stuff that's outside the cells, can be like all different densities depending on the tissue. It's really liquidy in some tissues. In other tissues, it's more like jello consistency. In bone, the matrix is dense. It's very, very dense and hard. That makes sense, right? Think about your bones. Your bones are very hard. That's what makes them so strong, because the matrix is really, really dense. The matrix, the extracellular stuff in your bones, is made out of a lot of collagen and other similar proteins, and then tons and tons of calcium salts. What we see is that we'll have like collagen kind of builds a substructure or like a framework, and then the calcium comes and gets packed in here, and there's all different types of calcium salts, but the calcium gets packed in, and then that makes this really strong bone matrix. Because this dense matrix, because most of the bone is actually this really, really hard matrix, and it's so dense and so strong, this is what allows the bones to withstand the compression forces that are always pushing down on them. If you think about, the bones in your legs, for example, they're relatively long and thin, and we can have a lot of body weight pushing down on them. In some cases, hundreds of pounds pushing down on those bones, and they don't bend, they don't bow, they don't get squished. The bones are able to stand up to all of that weight pushing down on them because they're so strong. Now, we have two general types of bone tissue: compact bone and spongy bone. Both of these types of bone have the same types of cells, and they have a similar bone matrix. It's just that the tissue is organized in a different way. Compact bone has the tissue organized very compact. There's not a lot of open spaces, whereas spongy bone has a lot of open spaces in it where there's not any bone tissue. We will look at both of these types of bone. So we'll start with compact bone. Again, compact bone consists of very tightly packed bone tissue that lacks internal spaces. So almost all of the area in compact bone is jam-packed with matrix. There's matrix everywhere, really, really compact. And this makes it really, really strong. Compact bone provides protection and support. And this is the bone that's really good at resisting compression. So if you have to have like a long, thin bone, and you want the thin part of that bone to be really strong, you'll make it out of compact bone. We're going to look at the structure of compact bone. I'll go through and talk about it with you here on this slide, and then we'll look at the picture, and the picture is really helpful. The osteon is the basic unit of compact bone. So what that means is that if you were looking at an area of compact bone, it's made up of a bunch of osteons. So it gets organized into these little osteons, and you see a bunch of them packed together to make the compact bone. When we look at an osteon, in the very middle of the osteon, there's something called a central canal. So it goes up the middle like this. And that central canal is there to bring blood vessels and nerves up through the bone tissue. There are living cells in the bone, so they need a blood supply. And the bone tissue is really hard and dense, so the blood vessels can't just cut through the bone randomly wherever they want to go. They need a pathway. They need to have a nice roadway carved out for them. So that's what these canals are for. They provide a roadway for blood vessels to travel deep within the bone. So in the middle of each osteon, there's a central canal. And then there are perforating canals that run perpendicular to the central canal. So the central canal's in the middle, and then there are perpendicular canals like this that go out sideways. And again, those are all just there for blood vessels. Then we see that radiating out in a circle around this central canal, we have our cells, our osteocytes. Right? And again, they're arranged in these little lamella. Okay, they're called concentric lamella. They're concentric layers that radiate out around the central canal. So there will be like a little osteocyte, the cell, a little osteocyte, right? And they go all the way around in a circle like this. And then out further, there'll be another circle that goes around. Right? And then out further, there's another circle that goes around. And this is all, it's like a cylinder because it's 3D. Now, in between the osteocytes, there are layers of bone matrix. So there's hard, dense matrix all surrounding all of these osteocytes. Right? And then there's another layer out here. And then another layer out here. So these layers that go out, it's like a circle and then another circle and another circle. And if you think back to math, remember that's called concentric when they're within each other like this. So that's why we say that there are concentric lamella, right? These layers of matrix here, of bone matrix, they're called concentric lamella. Lamella is just like layer. Okay, so you'll have, again, bone cells, bone matrix, bone cells, bone matrix. Now you see that these bone cells are like completely surrounded by bone matrix. And the bone matrix is really, really hard and dense. So the cells need like a little bit of space around them to kind of like give them their own home and room to breathe, if you will. So around each cell, we see that there's a little open space. And that little open space that the cell has is called a lacuna. So each osteocyte is in a small space called a lacuna. And then everything else is just kind of covered with the layers of bone matrix, the concentric lamella. Now, there are tiny little channels that are present in here that go from one lacuna to the next lacuna. And these little tiny channels are called canaliculi. Those are there so that the cells can reach out and communicate with each other. So they'll extend their cytoplasm. They'll like reach little arms out through these channels so that they can reach out towards each other and communicate. Let me see. Okay, so let's look at this picture really quick and then I'll go back and talk about the membranes. So first off, we're talking about bone, and there are two major types of bone. There's compact bone and there's spongy bone. This right here in the middle, that is spongy bone. You can see there's all these big open spaces in it. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a second. Right now, what we're focusing on is this compact bone out here. Notice it does not have a lot of open spaces, right? It's really jam-packed with dense bone matrix. It's compact. Compact bone is made up of a bunch of osteons. Okay, so each of these little like circular units that you see, each of these is an osteon. So that's an osteon. That is. Okay, so a bunch of osteons together give us the structure of compact bone. Each osteon has a central canal bringing blood vessels up the middle, and then perforating canals that go perpendicular to that. So you can see this is how the blood vessels get all throughout the bone tissue. And then radiating out from that central canal, we just have our layers, right? We'll have like dense bone matrix and then cells, dense bone matrix and then cells, dense bone matrix and then cells. And that gives us the osteon. So when you look here at each of the osteons, each of these little like areas right here, that's showing you the osteocyte inside the lacuna. Okay, so each of those little kind of darker spots that you see is where there's a bone cell living in its little space, its little lacuna. And then all of this kind of tannish yellow stuff, that's the really dense bone matrix. So you can see, again, it goes out in these layers. There's a layer, and then you have your cells. Then there's another layer, and then you have your cells. Then there's another layer. That's the osteon. These like layers of matrix that radiate out in circles, those are called concentric lamella. So the osteons have concentric lamella. You'll notice around the very outside of the bone, there are layers of cells and matrix that go around the whole bone tissue. So they're not actually part of the osteon. They're just like, they're layers that are circling around the whole entire bone. Those are called circumferential lamella. Okay, circumferential layers, because they go around the circumference of the bone, right around the whole outside of the bone tissue. Now, bone has membranes covering it, just like most organs. Most organs have membranes. Bone has membranes as well. There's a periosteum and an endosteum. The periosteum is the membrane that covers the outside of bones. So like you have this whole big huge bone right here, the outside of the bone has a membrane that surrounds it called the periosteum. If you haven't noticed yet, we keep seeing osteo, right? Osteocyte, osteoblast, periosteum. Osteo means bone. Okay? Osteo means bone. Peri means around. So the periosteum goes around the bone, goes around the outside of the bone. The periosteum covers the outer surfaces of all bones except for the very ends of the bone that are enclosed in joint capsules. So at the very end of the bone where it comes together with another bone, that's a joint, right? Bones come together at joints, like the knee joint, the elbow joint, the shoulder joint. Those joints are really special little areas that are enclosed in joint capsules. And we fill it with fluid, and there's all sorts of special structures there. But at the end, the part that's in the joint capsule, that part does not have a periosteum. But the rest of the bone is covered with the periosteum. Now the periosteum has two layers. The outer layer is a really strong, kind of thick, fibrous layer. It has a lot of collagen present to give it strength. This really just surrounds the bone, and it separates the bone from all the other structures in the body. There's also an inner layer. The inside layer of the periosteum is a cellular layer. So a cellular layer meaning it has cells present. So cells like, for example, osteoprogenitor cells. Those are stem cells that can divide and then fuse into the bone. You can cross off this bottom part. Not really worried about the perforating fibers. The endosteum is the other membrane that's present in the bone. I told you that osteo means bone, endo means within. So the endosteum is the membrane that's within the bone. It is an inner membrane. This is a much more delicate membrane. It doesn't have to separate the bone from other tissues. It's much more protected since it's inside the bone. So it doesn't have that strong fibrous part. It's just a much more delicate, incomplete cellular layer. So the endosteum is just made of cells. Again, it lines all of the inside surfaces within the bone. So it lines the like the central canals and the perpendicular canals that we just looked at. Perpendicular. And the perpendicular canals, those are open areas inside the bone, so they're lined with an endosteum. The endosteum lines the medullary cavity or the marrow cavity. When we look in the middle of our long bones, like the femur, for example, in the very center of the bone, there's a cavity that's hollowed out called the marrow cavity or medullary cavity. Since it's an open area, it's lined with the endosteum. The endosteum lines or covers the trabeculae of spongy bone. We just saw that spongy bone has these like rods of bone tissue, right? And then there's open area in the middle of them. The trabeculae, those are these rods of bone. So there's these, like in this case, these 3 rods of bone tissue or 3 trabeculae. They would be lined with the endosteum. It would cover their surfaces. I said that the endosteum is just made of cells. It contains osteoblasts, stem cells called osteoprogenitor cells, and osteoclasts. And the endosteum is also important in bone growth and repair. The outside of this bone out here would be covered with the periosteum. So this layer out here is the periosteum, and then the endosteum would cover any inner surfaces. So the endosteum would be present here, right, covering all of these trabeculae of the spongy bone. The endosteum would cover these central canals and perpendicular canals. Okay, so the endosteum is within the bone, the periosteum is on the outside of the bone. So that's the general structure of compact bone. Spongy bone is spongy, right? And it looks just like a sponge. If you've ever seen like a natural sponge, a real sponge that they pull out of the ocean, it has a lot of holes in it, right? It's not a solid structure. And spongy bone is just like that. It has a lot of holes in it, a lot of open areas. Now, the reason we have spongy bone is that it makes our bones lighter. If all of our bones were made completely of compact bone, our skeleton would be very, very heavy. It would be very hard for us to move. So it is important that we have spongy bone where we can have it in order to make the bones a bit lighter. The spongy bone also protects our bone marrow. And I'll talk to you about that in just one second. But essentially, the bone marrow is in the spongy bone. So it's important in that it surrounds and protects the bone marrow. Spongy bone forms the interior of a lot of our small bones. So for example, like the bones in our wrist, our carpal bones, are these small kind of boxy bones. And they'll have a thin layer of compact bone around the outside like this. And then the whole inside will be made of this spongy bone. It forms the inside of the skull bones. So same thing, our skull bones are these really flat bones, and they'll have layers of compact bone around the outside, but then the whole inside of them is spongy bone with all of these open spaces. Finally, spongy bone also forms the expanded ends of our long bones. When we look at our long bones, again, they're typically kind of thin, but then at the end they get wider. And these ends are made out of mostly spongy bone. When we look at spongy bone, again, it's not very dense. The matrix forms an open network of trabeculae, or thin interconnected rods of bone tissue. So you'll have bone tissue like this, then bone tissue coming in this direction, bone tissue coming here, right? And you'll have bone tissue going in all of these different directions, and there's open spaces between them. So these rods of bone are the trabeculae, and then the open spaces in between are where we have our red bone marrow. So there would be red bone marrow here, red bone marrow here, red bone marrow here. There are no blood vessels in the trabeculae. These rods of bone tissue are really thin, so they don't have like open canals inside them where blood vessels go. They do have really thin little canaliculi, really thin little channels though, that connect into the bone marrow. And what happens is nutrients like glucose and oxygen, all that good stuff, will diffuse from the red bone marrow into the bone tissue. So they don't actually need blood vessels inside these trabeculae. They're really small, and all of the good stuff can go straight from the red bone marrow into the bone tissue. Again, the point of this red bone marrow is that that's where we form our blood cells. We said that includes red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Here, this is showing you the wide end of the femur. The femur is the bone in the thigh. And this is the top end of it, the end that forms your hip joint. Technically, these expanded ends of our wide bones are called epiphyses. Epiphyses, or if it's just one, it would be epiphysis with an I at the end. So these epiphyses, these widened ends, again, are made mostly of spongy bone. And if you look at this is a picture of a real bone, you can see that there's all these open spaces. There's thin little like struts of bone tissue, and then a lot of open spaces in between. In the picture down here, you can kind of see how it's organized, right? These little rods of bone tissue are called trabeculae. And then again, all the open area in between is where we would have a red bone marrow. If we cut this open and look inside it here, you'll see the way that we still have like concentric lamella. There's still a cell and then a layer of bone matrix. And then cells, right, osteocytes, and then another layer of bone matrix. It's just that that's all we have, right? It's just that, and that makes up the whole trabeculae, the whole rods of bone tissue. There's no other canals present. There's nothing else. It's just that. And then again, this is lined with the endosteum. So the membrane on the outside is the endosteum, because we're still on one of the inner surfaces inside the bone. So you saw the general kind of organization of bone tissue, right? It's either really compact or it's more open and spongy. Now we're going to talk about the different types of bone cells that are present in the bone. We'll see all four of them kind of pointed out on this slide, and I'll kind of introduce each of the different types of cells. And then the rest of the lecture really just goes into more detail. We'll talk about each of the types of cells in more detail. Okay, so I told you guys that bone cells make up only about 2% of bone mass. So the bone is mostly matrix. There's not very many cells present. But the cells are very important because they're the ones that actually make the matrix. Bones contain 4 different types of cells: osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteoprogenitor cells, and osteoclasts. So you see this prefix osteo over and over and over again, right? And osteo means bones. So the osteocyte, oocyte means cell. So osteocyte literally means bone cell. Osteocytes are the most common types of cells that we have in our bones, and these are mature bone cells. Osteocytes are always found in the center tissue of bone. So like in here, right, you see it's completely surrounded by bone matrix, or in the middle of one of these rods of bone tissue. And the reason for that is that, so they're never on the surface. They're not part of like the endosteum or the periosteum, because osteocytes are always completely surrounded by bone matrix. Right? You'll see that there's bone matrix all around it. The osteocyte live in the lacuna, so they're the cells that have that little tiny space around them, and then they're just full of matrix. Osteocytes, their job is to maintain the matrix that surrounds them. So all of this matrix that's surrounding this osteocyte, the osteocyte's entire life is spent keeping that matrix strong. And it does this, it maintains the matrix by doing 2 different things. One, it breaks it down, and then it rebuilds it again. So it can break bone down, and it can build the bone. It's the only cell that can do both. Okay, the osteocyte is the only cell that does both. We think of this as like bone remodeling. Hey, you can't just make your bones and then forget them for life and expect them to stay strong. You can't do that with anything. Imagine if you built a house and then just left it and you never did anything. No upkeep, no remodeling, no cleaning, no fixing, nothing. The house would degrade, right? It would break down. And your bones, you can't just make them and leave them. You have to do upkeep. And that's what these osteocytes do. Okay, they break the collagen, they release the calcium, and then they make new, strong collagen, and they pack the calcium back in. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells. We have a lot of different types of cells that we call blasts, and I always think of blasts as baby cells. Okay, blasts are babies. So osteoblast is like a baby bone cell. These are immature bone cells. They're located at a surface of the bone. So you see like right here, it's taken from the outer surface. So osteoblasts can be part of the periosteum. They can be part of the endosteum, but they're always at the surface. What osteoblasts do is they secrete the bone matrix. So you can think of blasts as building bone. So this osteoblast here, you can see it's building. Osteoid is the name of like the stuff that it makes. It's laying down this osteoid, and then that's going to get packed with calcium and become bone. When osteoblasts build bone like this, they end up putting calcium or storing calcium in bones. Remember, the bones are where we store calcium, so we've got to be able to pack it into the bones and take it out. The blasts are the ones that pack it into the bone. Okay, when they start building more bone tissue, we start taking calcium out of the blood and putting it into the bone. Now, eventually, these osteoblasts will start building bone and building bone, and they'll build so much bone that the bone matrix completely surrounds them. Then, all of a sudden, once they're surrounded by bone matrix, that stimulates them maturing, and they'll mature into osteocytes. Okay, so once they're surrounded by matrix, they become osteocytes. Osteoprogenitor cells are also at the surface. In this case, we see it right here as part of the endosteum. Osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells. Stem cells are like reproduction cells. They reproduce all the time. They divide and divide and divide, and they give us new cells. So osteoprogenitor cells divide, and they give us osteoblasts. Okay, so when this osteoblast matures and becomes an osteocyte, well, then that means we need another osteoblast to replace it. Okay, so that's where this progenitor cell comes in. It'll divide and make a new osteoblast. And then the osteoblast will mature and become an osteocyte. So those three cells are all related to each other. The osteoclast is different. Osteoclasts are their own types of cells. They're also at the surface. And osteoclasts are the ones that release things to break the bone down. So they make acids and enzymes that literally chew up and dissolve the bone. When you dissolve the bone, you release the calcium from it. So osteoclasts dissolve the bone matrix to release calcium. So if I did not have enough calcium in my blood and I needed it, I could take it out of my bones, right? But it's like, how do you get it out of your bones? Well, the osteoclasts are how you do that. All right, so we're just going to quickly kind of go through all four types of bone cells again, and then that will be it for this lecture. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that live in the lacuna, in the small little space. That means that they're completely surrounded by matrix. They're sandwiched between layers or lamella of bone matrix, and they connect to each other via little extensions of their cytoplasm, little like octopus arms that reach out through canaliculi. Remember, canaliculi are like tiny little channels that go through the bone matrix. And they allow the neighboring osteocytes to be able to talk to each other, to communicate with each other. Osteocytes do not have the ability to divide, right, like osteoprogenitor cells do, but this makes sense. If you think of you have a cell in a tiny little space, it's completely blocked in, you don't want it dividing. If it starts to divide and make more cells, it's going to get really squished and die. The major functions of osteocytes are to maintain the protein and mineral content of the matrix. So in other words, just to keep the surrounding matrix strong. And I already mentioned the way that it does this, right? It does this by breaking down, then building the bone. It can also be, or osteocytes can also help repair damaged bones. So typically they're just keeping the bone matrix strong, but if there's a break or some sort of a fracture in the bone, then obviously the osteocytes in the area will start building bone really rapidly to try and repair that fracture. Blasts are baby cells that build the bone. So match up the bees. Blasts are babies that build. So they are immature bone cells that make and secrete the bone matrix compounds. Technically, the stuff that's made by the osteoblasts isn't bone tissue yet. It's called osteoid. Osteoid literally means resembles bone. So the osteoblasts, it's not technically bone because it's not calcified yet. It's got to get calcium packed in it. But the osteoblasts will like build the matrix kind of substructure, right? And then calcium will get packed in there from the blood. So you can still think of them as building bone. Eventually, when the osteoblasts become surrounded by bone, then they mature into osteocytes. Since the osteoblasts build the bone, they're the ones that are responsible for packing calcium into the bones. So when we have too much calcium in the blood, it's the osteoblasts that are going to start working really heavily to get that calcium out of the blood and into the bone tissue. Osteoprogenitor cells, we said, are stem cells, right? Think of it like genitor, like generate. Hey, they're generating osteocytes. They're generating bone cells. Technically, the technically, when the osteoprogenitor cells divide, they produce osteoblasts first, and then eventually the blasts mature into osteocytes. Osteoprogenitor cells, we said, are located at the surfaces, so they're in the membranes that line both the outer surface and the inner passageways through the bone. So the progenitor cells are in the periosteum and in the endosteum. Osteoclasts are the ones that break the bone down. They secrete acids and enzymes and release them onto the bone, and that dissolves the bone matrix in order to release all of the stored minerals, especially calcium. We call that process osteolysis. Osteo like bone, and remember, to lyse something is to break it apart. So when we need to get calcium out of the bones, we stimulate our osteoclasts and they perform osteolysis. They dissolve the bone matrix and release all of that calcium. Osteoclasts are these really big multinucleate cells. Multinucleate meaning one cell has many nuclei. Most of our cells have one nucleus, right? But these cells have a lot of nuclei. And that's important. That helps them be able to produce all of these enzymes really, really rapidly. And these osteoclasts are derived from a completely different cell line. They come from the same types of stem cells that produce macrophages. Macrophages are immune system cells that are like Pac-Man. They go around the body and they eat and digest anything that shouldn't be there. So you can kind of see the relation, right? Digesting things, breaking things down. But my point is that osteoclasts are not related to the other three types of cells. Now we have kind of opposite things happening, right? We have the osteoblasts building bone, and then we have the osteoclasts chewing up the bone. Now these activities have to balance in order for homeostasis to occur. If there's more building or if there's more breakdown, then the bones are going to change in density. If there's more breakdown than building, obviously you're going to start chewing the bones up and you're going to start dissolving too much of the matrix and the bones will become weak. Immobility is something that commonly leads to a reduction in bone mass. If somebody is not active, say they had a major injury and they have to stay in bed for a long period of time, that can lead to a reduction in bone mass. The bones can become weaker because of that. Our bones need to be stressed out. They need to have to hold up against the weight of our body in order for them to stay strong. If there's more building of bones than breakdown, so if we just keep building and building and building and we're not breaking them down, then the bones are going to actually strengthen. Weight-bearing exercise can actually strengthen and stimulate bone mass because it stimulates the osteoblasts to build bone. This is why as people age and they become more prone to osteoporosis, we tell them to exercise, because that exercise will help to keep your bones strong. It makes the osteoblasts keep working harder. We'll talk more about osteoporosis and bone density in part 2 of the lecture. All right, guys, that is it for part one. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email, and then I will get part two uploaded probably tomorrow.